The brain is a remarkably powerful place. The central organ of the human nervous system. It's made up of 100,000 miles of blood vessels. That's almost 4 times larger than the distance around the equator. Neurons transmit and receive information that tells us when to breathe, when something is painful, warns us when there is danger, and tells us when to cheer for the touchdown. Within the brain, there are 100 billion neurons who pass information as fast as 250 miles per hour. That could outpace a Formula One race car. The power of the brain is remarkable. But what if our brains have adopted a mindset that needs an upgrade? Are we in danger of being trapped in our mindsets? How do we stop these mindsets from becoming mind traps?
You know, hearing some of those questions, like the brain reminds you when to cheer for a touchdown. I don't know about you, but there's something about sporting events that just get the best of you. For me personally, maybe this is just me, maybe this is just a little bit of therapeutic session, and thank you very much. But if you're in the room and you're seeing something incredible, maybe it's not a football game, maybe it is that crescendo of the opera that you're like, I don't even know, am I using the right terminology? I think I am. It's just like, woo! And that's why I'm not in the opera. And you just feel the emotion and you start cheering and you're like, what just happened? And it's just so exciting. And sometimes your mind gets the best of you, doesn't it? In fact, the question that was asked is, have you ever felt trapped? I mean, really, have you ever felt this idea of being trapped? None of us really like it, if we're honest. Several years ago, I was with a bunch of pastors in England, and probably many of you would say, if that were me, I would have felt trapped. I mean, just being with a bunch of pastors, that can be overwhelming, and then you put all of us in a different country. It only got worse, if I can just be honest with you. We were all together as a bunch of us, and we were staying at this hotel, and we were on a mission adventure, and so the hotel was enough of an adventure. We all got in this elevator, and as we're getting on the elevator, one of the guys comments, I hope it can hold all of our weight. It didn't. In fact, it went up about 6 feet and stopped and was done. And it was a smaller elevator. There was a lot of us pastors, probably about a dozen of us, and we're all like crammed in this place. And if you ever felt claustrophobic, this was the time. And not only that, I'm sitting there thinking like, it's just like a bunch of pastors. And so what do pastors do when they feel trapped? They just start praying. And I'm like, oh my, what is going on here? Like, I'm sure for me, I'm like, what's the practical way to do this? And so there was a couple of guys that got there and they start prying the door open, and we pry it open, and then somebody above could tell that it was stuck, and so he pries his side over, and there was about a 6-foot clearing that we all just started climbing on each other and climbing out, and we got out, but it was a little shaky of a 15 minutes. Have you ever felt trapped? Maybe not with a bunch of pastors in an elevator in a different country, but have you ever felt trapped? Maybe it's not necessarily in an elevator, but maybe you felt trapped in a car, in a bus. Maybe you've been on a plane where you got on the plane and you get on to the tarmac and all of a sudden the plane starts taxiing away, and then you hear those dreaded words, we're going to have to go back. There's a little bit of a mechanical failure, but no worries. It'll be just a few minutes, and they don't let you off the plane, but you're stuck on the plane, and sometimes the planes feel about as warm as it does in here, and it's just one of those things that you feel trapped. Some of you in here today, you're like, I feel trapped right now. Like, when are you going to stop? We will soon. Trust me. About 45 after, we'll land the plane and we'll send you home. But maybe it wasn't that. Maybe you've been trapped in a conversation. You found yourself at a dinner party, and there was one person that was sitting aside, and you walked over and you thought you were just going to be nice, and you began talking to them. And then 30 minutes later, your ride comes over and says, hey, we've got to go. And you're like, thank you for the out. Like, maybe you work with somebody like that, and you've told somebody in your job that, hey, if this person ever comes to me, just call me, send me a text message. That way I have, oh, look, my phone rang. Thanks, I'll see you later. I know none of y'all have ever done that. You might actually be doing that to me sometimes, and that's okay, right? But how many of you have ever felt trapped? Maybe in a bus or a car or a plane. I mean, the truth is, none of us ever like to feel trapped. None of us like the idea of feeling overwhelmed, of feeling like we can't move forward. But isn't it true that sometimes we can get trapped in our own minds? We can get trapped in our own minds, and the thoughts that we have, they can begin to overwhelm us and they can challenge us. And there's something inside of us that we know is holding us back. There's something inside of us that's getting the best of us. There's something inside of us that's keeping us from truly experiencing what God wants for our lives. And yet in the middle of it, we feel trapped. We feel like there's something there that's not letting us move forward. Well, for the course of this series, the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at this idea of these mindsets. These mindsets that get in the way. A mindset is basically, it's a mentality or it's a way of thinking. It's this idea of who we are and what's going on inside of us. And once we really begin to get our mindset right, isn't it true that we can begin to make better decisions? In fact, the beginning of this year, we began this series. We began this year really talking about some of the ideas and thoughts that I really believe characterize followers of Jesus. And one of the things we talked about is this idea that in order to change our outcomes, and many of us want to change the destination with which we're in order to change the outcomes, we have to begin to change the decisions that we make. But it's not just easy like, hey, I'm going to change the decision. But to get to the bottom of the decisions we need to change, we've got to change the way we think or change our beliefs. And in many instances, the thinking gets in the way and we begin to allow some of the thoughts and the mindsets get in front of us and keep us from living out what God has called us to live. And the problem that I've seen is in many instances, the mindset or the thoughts that we have, they create feelings. And those feelings are what typically leads us to making the decisions that we make. The decisions that sometimes we're proud of, decisions that sometimes we get frustrated by. So for the next several weeks, we're going to be looking at this idea of how do we get out of these mind traps? Because it's more than a feeling. We believe and we understand that there's feelings that are involved, of course, but how do we really get to the next level? How do we get to where we legitimately change our thinking so that we can make better decisions, so that we can get to a better outcome? So today, what I want us to do is we're going to look at one of the first traps. And to set us up, there's this incredible thinker. I've been reading a book every morning. It's the Stoics Guide to Living Your Best Life. And for me, there's this idea of mindfulness that is such a value, of being able to really think about and process and to really lean in and to really make the most of it and not let the distractions of the day get the best of us. Well, there's this philosopher who was a great Stoic, if you would. His name is Epictetus. and he made this statement. It's a really cool name, Epictetus. He made this statement. He said, "We are disturbed not by things, but by the view with which we take of them." We're not disturbed by things as much as we're disturbed by the view with which we take of them. It's not necessarily the things that come into our life, it's the way we see the things that come into our life. And to really get us into where we're going today, Helen Keller, who, if you know anything about Helen Keller, she's an incredible lady. She lived a remarkable life, and she had some hiccups in her life. Not only was she blind, but she was deaf and mute as well. There were incredible limitations to her reality. And yet, listen to what Helen Keller said. Self-pity is our worst enemy. And if we yield to it, we can never do anything wise in this world. Self-pity is our worst enemy. And if we yield to it, we can never do anything wise in this world. Today, we're going to look at the first mindset that can get in the way and can trap us. And it's the mindset of the victim trap. I don't know about you, but some of us, me specifically, I've played this card. In fact, I remember about 2.5 years ago, I found this card right in my deck, and I was playing it like crazy. What happened was, it was a morning, I was in Grand Prairie, I didn't quite know where I was going, and so I was stopped at a red light. I took a left, went over an overpass, and I was supposed to go right through the next light, and then I was going to find a right or a left, and I was going to turn in to my destination. It's a little early, but I didn't quite know where I was going. And so I go through when the light turns green. That's a key component to the story. When the light turns green, I took a left, and then I looked down at my maps to figure out where I was going. And as I'm looking down at my maps, I'm assuming that the next light as we go through the overpass is going to be green as well, because that's how all the lights are around Heritage Trace and around our area. And I just kept going, wasn't speeding by any stretch of the imagination, but I did not realize, because I was not paying attention, that the light that I was about to go through had not turned green yet. In fact, it was still red. In fact, there was somebody coming through that intersection. In fact, that's why I don't drive that red SUV anymore. I had to get another car because that car got totaled. And I remember leaving that scene, and I'm thinking all the justifications I can put in my mind, because this wasn't my fault. Right? I was lost. This wasn't my fault. They should have figured out how to make all of the overpasses uniform. When you go through one and you're getting ready to go straight, like, it should be green already. This is the way everything is except for this one intersection. And to make matters worse, whenever I started talking to the police officer, he's like, oh, there's always wrecks here. So that just added to my victim card, right? Like, it's not my fault. The city's figuring this out. It's not my fault. The lights were not working. It's not my fault. I'm lost. Isn't it true that we tend to always play the victim card to try to justify our own behaviors and own actions? Maybe as a parent, you have a child that goes to school and gets in a fight, and what happens? It's not your child's fault, right? You begin to look at every other scenario around, and you're like, I'm going to figure out how it's not my child's fault. They are a good kid, trust me. I raised them. They are angels, right? It's not my child's fault. Maybe you didn't get the promotion that you wanted, and you're frustrated. And you're sitting there trying to think through everything you've done, and the person who got the promotion, oh my goodness, they don't do this and they don't do that. I mean, they're always at the water cooler. They're always talking. When we're on Zoom meetings, they always are blacked out, and I am the one that shows the video. I'm the one paying. I mean, how many times whenever we begin to look at life, and I mean, we play these victim cards continuously. Maybe it's not your work scenario. Maybe it's a friend. You've got a great friend that you want to go out with, and y'all are looking forward to going and grabbing dinner together, and the couple hours before you go to grab dinner, what happens? They call you up and they say, hey, I can't do it. I've got to study. I've got something going on. I've got a kid who's got sickness, and it's unbelievable. You don't want to be around me. I mean, they're both ends. It's not healthy. You don't want to see me right now, right? Like, they come up with excuses, and what's in the back of your mind? Well, it's something about me. They don't like me. What's wrong? Why do they always make excuses for hanging out with me? What is happening? We play the victim card more often than we like. I mean, we could go on and on. Maybe it's been that way with friends, with neighbors. Maybe it's been that way in small groups at church. I mean, if we're not careful, we can find ourselves in the victim trap. So here's a question I want to ask you. Where do you find yourself making excuses for what's going on in your life? I mean, if we're going to be honest, the victim mentality, what it does is it causes us to blame everyone else for what happens in our world. Nothing is my fault. It causes us to blame everything else on everybody else because I've got it all together. A victim would say things like this: I'm always at a disadvantage because of my circumstances. Everyone is out to get me. Everyone else has had an easier life, and it's always hard for me. You know, there's these sayings that we find in and through our life that if we're not careful, we'll fall into this victim mentality. Maybe we have conversations with other people, and we're constantly trying to bait people to affirm us. We're constantly trying to bait people to pat us on the back because we want somebody to see or to experience what we're going through or the hurts that we're going through. Now, I want to caution you for a second. Because talking about this victim trap, I am fully aware that when we begin to talk about individuals that feel victimized, there are significant hurdles, especially in our culture today. We find individuals that have been victimized because of racism, because of sexism, because of abuse. And you could name it. And these scenarios are significant. And I in no way want to belittle or cut people's legs out from under them and say, just get over it. But can I challenge you and encourage you? What if we change the vernacular a little bit? Instead of saying we're a victim, what if we changed it to saying something more like we're survivors? Because there's a beautiful tinge in that when we begin to look at our scenario and our circumstances and we begin to realize that maybe there's something on the other side of this. And I don't want people to think that I want to make light of it, because when I talk about my wreck and when I talk to somebody else that begins talking about the way that they've been mistreated because of their skin color, the way they've been mistreated because of something that happened, these are on far different wavelengths. But isn't it true that in many instances we can use our circumstances to try to warrant self-pity, to try to warrant other aspects that maybe aren't necessarily what God has wanted for you? Speaking of which, there's an individual in the Old Testament. His name's Joseph. He's a remarkable individual. In fact, you've probably heard the story of Joseph a time or two. Joseph was an individual. He was one of 12 sons. He had 10 half-brothers. He had one full brother. His dad had 2 wives, and each wife had a lady that was living with her, a servant, and all 4 of those ladies were making babies for his dad, and so it just made this remarkably ridiculous family dynamic. Not only that, but Joseph was seen as the apple of Jacob's eye. He was the favorite. So if you've ever been in a relationship where the other person's the favorite, you know what it's like to be around the other people. And Joseph he got this really cool coat of many colors, and his dad would prop him up and tell all of his brothers to go do the hard work while Joseph got to hang out and just kind of do whatever his dad wanted him to do. And Joseph, from time to time, would have these dreams of his brother bowing down to him and his brothers coming to him and needing him and in desperate need of him. And he's like, look, I'm better than you. And it was constantly happening to such a degree that at one point, Jacob sent Joseph out to go care for his brothers and make sure they're okay. And one of his brothers looks up and he says, hey, look, here comes the dreamer now, and let's take him. And so they take him, they throw him into a cistern, and then next thing you know, they're about to kill him, but one of his brothers steps up and says, instead of killing him, we can make some money off of him. Let's sell him. Joseph was sold into slavery. But Joseph decided, I'm going to bounce back. I'm going to make the most of this. Even though I'm enslaved, I'm going to figure out what I can do to ensure that everybody that's going along with this, that I'm going to make sure that whoever is my master, that they are proud of the work that I do, and to such a degree that he got the chance to be Potiphar's second in command. I mean, he was right below Potiphar. Potiphar, who was overseeing the house that Joseph was a slave under, he loved Joseph so much that he entrusted Joseph with everything, well, except his wife. And Joseph was quite the handsome fella. And his wife, Potiphar's wife, not Joseph's, Potiphar's wife thought Joseph was a handsome fellow, and she kept coming on to him. And Joseph kept pushing back the advances. To such a degree, one time, Potiphar's wife grabs Joseph's coat. Joseph runs out. I don't know what he's wearing at this point, but it's not a necessary detail for the story. But he runs out without his coat, to which Potiphar's wife finds Potiphar and says, look at the servant that you have. He came on to me, and I yelled, and I got his coat. And now he's somewhere else, but he tried to take advantage of me. So he goes from being sold into slavery to being falsely accused. He gets thrown into Potiphar, who takes him, he throws him into prison. And while in prison, he meets this baker and this cupbearer who, they were the chief baker, the chief cupbearer. They were sitting there. They were chief to Pharaoh, and they got to do whatever Pharaoh wanted. In fact, the cupbearer, he would drink the drinks before Pharaoh would to ensure that there was no poison in it. If he lived, then Pharaoh could enjoy it. If he died, well, Pharaoh wouldn't drink it. And the baker was one of Pharaoh's chief bakers, that he would make and bake cakes all the time, and they had dreams. And basically, Joseph told them the dreams that they had, and so their dreams got lived out. They came true. And Joseph told these guys, hey, if this comes to be, I don't want you to forget about me. But when they went out, they forgot to tell him. Joseph was forgotten in prison. I mean, he's hoping for a break. He's hoping that something will go right. But for some odd reason, Joseph did not allow the circumstances to get the best of him. For some odd reason, each and every scenario, Joseph realized that God was up to something in and through his life. You see, throughout the course of Joseph's life, you see this open-handed reality. And even in prison, Joseph is asking some of the most remarkable questions. And for us, isn't it true that maybe we're not in a prison, but some of us find ourselves in certain scenarios that we would claim prison? We got the medical diagnosis. We got the end of a relationship. We've got these frustrating realities, and we find ourselves at wit's end asking God, why would you do this? For some of us, we found ourselves in that scenario, and our faith did not hold up, and we began to blame God and run away from God. Maybe that's your story. Maybe that is somebody you know's story, that when they found themselves in the circumstances of life and they found themselves in their own prison, they realized they couldn't live up to that. And Joseph, he had a different perspective. In fact, the question that I see living out in Joseph's life is a question that I think is valuable. Could God be setting up the circumstances around me to do something in me and through me? Could God be setting up the circumstances around me? Could God be setting up the hurdles, the frustrations, the broken relationships, the relationships that are coming together? Could God be setting up the circumstances around me to do something in me and through me? Back to Joseph, Genesis 50 begins to tell us a little bit about Joseph. So Joseph ends up being remembered, and Pharaoh ends up talking to him because Pharaoh has this dream that nobody can figure out. And so they bring Joseph in. He's the dream teller. He ends up telling Pharaoh that his dream is going to basically instill that there's going to be 7 good years. You better save all the food you can, because then there's going to be 7 lean years, and you are going to need your food. So figure it out. And Pharaoh's like, you're awesome. Let's put you in command. You're in control. Let's make it happen. So Joseph goes from being sold in slavery to being falsely accused to being forgotten to basically being Pharaoh's second in command. 7 years go by, there's remarkable food, there's just an overflow of harvest, and then 7 years of lean comes in, and what happens with Joseph in Egypt is different than what's happening in Canaan with Jacob and his brothers. You see, they did not necessarily heed advice. They did not have the food they needed, and so finally Jacob sends his brothers to Pharaoh to beg for food. And little did they know that they're walking in and begging their own brother for food. And in that moment, at first, they didn't realize who it was. And then all of a sudden, Joseph goes and he weeps because these are my brothers. I haven't seen them in forever. And listen to how Joseph responds finally whenever he talks to them. Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Yes, it's me, your brother. You sold me into slavery. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I'm not God here. I don't know why you did what you did, but you know what? Because of what you did, let me show you what I'm able to do. I am able to take care of you because of you selling me into slavery. Yes, it wasn't okay. And yes, I hated you forever, but God was in control in and through the circumstances. He says, but Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And he continues on. And he talks about it. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You see, God was aligning the circumstances of Joseph's life for his good. Oh, let me ask you this. Why would you not believe that of your story? When you begin to think about what you're walking through, when you begin to think about the hurdles that are at play, isn't it easy for us to begin to make excuses, to justify the scenarios, to even play the victim card and get frustrated? But could it be that God is setting up the circumstances around you to do something in you and through you? I mean, look at what Joseph says next to his family. He says, so then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. You see, Joseph took control of the scenario. He decided, I'm going to take care of the situation. I'm going to help my brothers out. I want to make sure that everything is okay. But for all of us, that can be a tricky thing. Because isn't it true that we like to have control? We like to try to control the scenario, and if I can play the victim card and make myself feel better about what I'm walking through, I want to play that card so that I can get the attention and the accolades for, oh my goodness, I can't believe you. Yeah, that's not okay. That should have been a green light. That's not your fault. You see, Joseph had to decide that he would choose to trust God in the circumstances. And in the midst of that, he got the chance to do good, not just for the nation of Egypt, but he got to do good for his brothers and his family as well. And instead of determining what we can't control in order to get into these mind traps, we need to work on figuring out what we can control. Because figuring out what we can control can be a game changer when we begin to figure these mindsets, these challenges. So here's what I would like to do. As we finish off, I want to give you a couple of thoughts to help create a game plan to get us out of the mind traps. And the first thing I want to encourage you to do is this, I want to identify your own victim thoughts. That can be one of the most critical things when we begin to figure out the mind traps, is to identify our own victim thoughts. What is it that comes into your mind whenever you see this self-pity that Helen Keller talks about? When you see that come in, what are the questions? What's going on? And one of the things I would encourage you to do is to build a life map. You know, one of the things that Doyle and I have talked about is to truly figure out what our life looks like in the future, to really begin to change the destinations that we have. It requires us being very honest about our past, about our circumstances. It involves us being very honest about what's gone on in our life, the highs, the lows, the ups, the downs. I would encourage you, and I would encourage everyone to begin to think about their life through the trajectory of a life map. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and you can find more information about that on social media. But I would encourage you to begin thinking about your own life map. What leads you to begin thinking about these victim mind traps? And the second thing is this, is I want to encourage you to be aware of the false beliefs of your victim thoughts. Be aware of the false beliefs. You know, so many of us, and maybe this isn't you, but for me, there's many false beliefs that I have chosen to be true. And many of them, they prop up these false beliefs, this victim mentality. But one of the things I would encourage you is be aware of the false beliefs that lead you to begin thinking that it's always my fault, pity is me, hurtful struggles, frustrations. Think through these mindsets. Be aware of the thoughts that lead you to go down that victim mentality. And the third thing that I would encourage you to do is this, is replace them with something more helpful. One of the things I've found is in order for us to take false beliefs out, we have to replace the false belief with something true. If we're struggling with insecurity, understanding God's purpose in our life can be such a valuable thing. If we're struggling with figuring out what is my purpose in life, beginning to look at what God says about us can be a valuable thing. You see, when we begin to replace them with something more helpful, it can be so remarkable. But it is so challenging. Because if I'm honest, I like to be in control. If I'm honest, I like to control the narrative. If I'm honest, I like to begin to think about life where people begin to have pity on me and they begin to see, oh my goodness, Scott, that is so hard. Pat you on the back. But when we begin to follow Jesus, what we find is this, is Jesus did not give us a victim mentality. Jesus gave us the opportunity not to be victims, but to be victorious. Jesus took on the cross for you and for me. He considered it remarkably, he opted to give up his own seat in heaven so that he could become a victim on your behalf so we can live victorious lives. When I think about the goodness that God gave us, I'm overwhelmed with the reality, this idea that God is God is good. In fact, Paul would say that it is his kindness, Lord, that leads us to repentance. Paul would encourage us that we can cast our cares upon him because he wants to walk with us through the muck and the mire that we find ourselves in. So, North Tarrant, here's my encouragement to you. And here's my challenge as we close is I know it's tempting at times to play the victim card. And I know for me, it is so easy for me to get lost in that mind trap. But when I get lost in the mind trap, I find that I get more focused on me than I'm focused on what God wants for me. And I believe following Jesus makes your life better and it makes you better at life. So can we learn from Joseph, who decided to put his circumstances aside and trust God that even though life is not okay, I'm going to walk with God through it. And yeah, you might find difficulties. You might get sold into slavery. You might be forgotten. You might be falsely accused. But in the end, whenever that is, I genuinely believe that God will see you through it. So rather than playing the victim card, would we identify? Would we begin to take on the life map? Rather than playing the victim card, would we identify and begin to show and to look and see those false beliefs? And would we replace them with what God has said about us? Would y'all pray with me? God, we love you. And we thank you so much for the fact that you are a big God. And God, if I could just be honest, it is so much easier for us to live in a victim mindset. But God, you have called us out of that, and you've called us not to be victims, but to be victorious, not to be victims, but to be survivors, not to be victims, but to be children of yours. And so God, regardless of what has us trapped today, I pray that we would see your goodness in it. God, for those that are in here today that are dealing with medical struggles, God, I pray that you would begin to show them how your life matches up with the circumstances at play. God, for those of us in here that are dealing with relationship tensions and struggles, for those that are dealing with broken relationships, new relationships, soured relationships, God, I pray that you would show us your kindness and your goodness, and that you would, Father, you would allow us to have the courage to do what you've called us to do. And God, for those of us in here that Father, for whatever reason over the last year, whether it be work or friendship, God, it seems like life has just not gone our way. God, I pray that you would give us a new outlook on life, that you would encourage us, that you would challenge us, and that, God, we would see life the way you intended it to be. God, I know it's a tall task. It's one that we need you. It's one that we're desperate for you. God, we ask all this in your Son's name. Amen.